All right, well, we have an update now on all of those protests in China over the past few days. They appear to be working, actually, surprisingly, although the Western media won't tell you that. According to our sources in China, the government is listening and easing more and more restrictions at this hour, thanks to those protests. Now, you won't really find any mention of this in the Western media
It's almost as if they're super disappointed. They had a grand old time on Monday presenting this downfall of the Chinese government. Right. Oh my God, what does it mean, right? And then on Tuesday, when the government actually responded to protests in a reasonable way, the mainstream media seems utterly disinterested in that. They're like, our fun's over. Thanks for that.
You mean in that country, protests actually work?
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, there's all those people, those thousands of people that go, march on Washington all the time. And
it has a purpose.
And nothing ever changes in Washington. So according to secondary reports out of China earlier this morning and our own primary sources inside of China, controls are expected to be relaxed. And earlier this morning, China's state council officials weren't suddenly wearing masks during their meeting. Now, up until now, they've always worn masks. Take a look at your screen at this meeting. So all of them removed masks. And look what these protests have brought. Now, look at the lower left-hand part of your screen. Even the translator in the lower left part of your screen, not a translator,
she's a sign interpreter.
Sign interpreter, yeah. She was always wearing a mask. So now, according to the Global Times, which is state-run media, by the way, China is going to speed up its vaccination program. So this is coming from the state in their own media for elderly people. This was one, of course, the biggest sticking points for lockdowns was the elderly population not getting access to vaccines. So now they're going to ramp up that process, which is crazy.
But they're not using the same vaccines we do, correct?
They are not. The Dr. Fauci over the weekend took the opportunity to kind of jab at them for that. Oh, that was a double entendre.
That was
right?
a great pun.
He took a jab that they did not import Western vaccines, instead used their own, and that's why their program has been slower. And he was like, well, we had some to sell. We weren't going to give it to you, but we had plenty on the market if you wanted to buy some, so this is your own fault. But interesting because this no mask on public officials during meetings, these tweets about, okay, we need to just because the elderly vaccination has been their sticking point, the reason why they continue to extend lockdowns in certain regions. So these are not small symbolic moves to show the public, we hear you, we're going to take this step.
Right. And so Global Times reporting China will speed up the COVID-19 vaccination rate for people age over 80 and continue to increase the rate for people age 60 and 79. There you go. And this is all coordinated.
Absolutely, it is. Again, it's to show the Chinese people that, they are listening. This is, yesterday we broke it down for you that protests are a cultural way in China for Chinese people to have a conversation with their government, whether right or wrong, it actually accomplishes certain things. So it's not for us Westerners to have the final say in its meaning.
But it's still amazing to watch everyone on Twitter in the West who's like, well, let me tell you what's going on in China.
Right.
All these Western Twitter accounts who've, have no idea actually. And they're getting their information from Western media sources on top of it. Today's stock market, this is not inexplicable. China's stock market booming because of this news. But again, the Western media won't show you this. They're not going to talk about the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and how that's doing. Instead, political pundits and Western media organizations are total hypocrites on this story. Because when the Chinese people protest, the world is supposed to stand with the Chinese people to throw off the shackles of tyranny and tell Xi Jinping where to shove it. But of course, when those very same people in Canada, the United States, and Australia, and other places, well, in Canada, where they park their trucks in Ottawa to say, we don't want these vaccine mandates. We don't want you telling us what to do with our bodies. Then suddenly, or people in Australia who are breaking out of internment camps, right?
France, people protesting Macron saying that the unvaccinated can stay home while the vaccinated enjoy public life.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. And then in Italy, too, people were down with the Italian government over crazy lockdowns and mandates in schools. And when it was like 100 degrees, still have your kids wear masks. And there was protests, right? When those people protest, then they are, of course, radical right-wingers. They're white supremacists. They're people to be vilified.
Extremists, anti-science, all of the things. things.
So Michael Tracy, I love this take on Twitter today. He said, there is no dispute that China's COVID policies are unusually stringent, but I seem to recall Australia had pretty stringent COVID policies at one point, and anyone who protested was instantly labeled a far-right menace rather than brave dissidents standing up for freedom.
So which is it? You can't have it both ways. Either you like anti-COVID protesters or you don't.
Yeah. Of course, that's exactly what happened. Remember when Australia started rounding people up, putting them in COVID internment camps, and if you didn't get, vaccinated, you wanted to live your life, you couldn't. They were rounding you up. I don't recall hearing the Western media actually complain about this. In fact, if you talked about it like we did on this show earlier this year or last year even, you were called, the comments were amazing to read because they were like, how can you spread this conspiracy theory? How you guys are, whatever, you guys are right-wing radicals. I'm like, well, first of all, we're not right-wing at all. I don't know where you got that from. We're not radical. We're just telling you what's actually happening in Australia. But we were vilified for that.
And so was Djokovic for just trying to go there
to play
tennis, right?
He's kicked out. He's an extremist. Because he takes care of his body and he's healthy and he doesn't want you putting something in his body so he can go play tennis? Like, really?
What a crazy guy.
So here's Haley Hodgson. She was taken by Australian investigators, put into a COVID internment camp without even having the virus. She was locked up for 14 days at a COVID camp that was built for 2,000 people. So they knew they wanted more people there. And she was on the Unheard show in Australia, and she had this to say. Listen.
It's horrible. It's a horrible feeling. You feel like you're in prison. You feel like you've done something wrong. It's inhumane what they're doing. Like you are so small. They just overpower you and you're literally nothing. It's like you do what we say or you're in trouble. We'll lock you up for longer. Yeah, they were even threatening me that if I was to do this again, we will extend your time in here.
So, unbelievable. She lost her job, too, because of that.
Well, that's like saying if you do that again, like even if your symptoms go away, you're virus free or whatever, it doesn't matter because you were, did something. It's basically going to become prison for you.
Right. And it'll probably be on your permanent record, right? It'll be on your permanent COVID ID record and your vaccine passport. Oh, she's one of those. It'll be like some sort of a badge that she'll have to show on her smartphone. Oh, you were a dissident. And we know, by the way, that these governments are watching people like her, right? They have a database of these people.
Yes.
We know that they've been actively tracking them in the United States and Canada and other places. Like
yes.
You're a rabble rouser. Like you're the type of person that we want to watch if we're the intelligence state in these countries. So, shut up, little girl. Take your vaccine, shut up. And oh, by the way, so when she got put into this COVID camp, she revealed that she was told to take Valium. They forced pharmaceuticals on her, telling her, hey, take this Valium because you're in distress. And so you get basically turned into like a sedated drone. Like
that sounds kind of fun, though. Like 2-week hotel stint with some Valium. The only thing is that Valium constipates you. So that's not fun. But otherwise, I'm kind of like...
I wouldn't know.
Well... Who's watching my kids?
Did you have a Valium addiction we should know about?
No, but I'm just saying, after I was sick for a couple days, stayed in my room, didn't speak to anybody. That's still kind of great.
So next I'll just give you a box of Valium.
I don't want any because like I said, it constipates you.
Well, I'm glad to know that. Thank you for that medical update.
Oh, you're welcome.
Natalie's medical update.
This is a known fact.
What medication constipates you?
Just take Valium with a bunch of coffee. You'll be fine.
Right.
I don't know. That doesn't sound relaxing at all.
Welcome to Natalie's Constipation Corner. This is what constipates you.
I can have my own COVID fantasy. You have yours.
So maybe, but that's your choice, right? To take Valium and be constipated. She was not, and they were, here you go.
That shouldn't be forced on you. If
here
you
go.
Think that sounds fun.
And you're being forced into this internment camp. And by the way, you were referred to as a conspiracy theorist when we covered this story about the Australian internment camps. I mean, literally, people mocked us for it here on this show. They told us we were liars. Don't fall for that story. It's garbage. Last year, regime lovers told us that we were bad people, and by the way, that these people who didn't want to take the vaccine were causing trouble. They didn't want the government doing these things to their bodies. They were rabble rousers. They were labeled conspiracy theorists. Watch this in Canada.
They are patently false, yet disinformation campaigns and conspiracy theories have become a fact of our lives these days, particularly in politics. Most get ignored, even laughed off. But there is one theory suggesting Canadians will be forced into COVID-19 internment camps that has now caught the attention of the Prime Minister.
I was chatting with a group of students the other day, and a young woman asked me about COVID internment camps, and I had to explain that as we consume increasing amounts and various sources of information online and around us, we need to continue to be attentive to source. We need to continue to be attentive to comparing various reports and looking for trusted sources.
Oh, okay. Trusted sources. So it was all fake then, of course. What he was saying was all a lie. Canadians also had quarantine hotels where they were locked up and weren't allowed to leave. Did you know about that in Canada? They kept that quiet. Tiffany Gorara details her family's grueling stay at a federal quarantine facility in Canada, locked up by Canadian authorities. Watch.
I mean, it was an extremely difficult and, onerous and traumatic process for myself and our two daughters. My husband hasn't traveled back with us as yet. TBD if he decides to follow. But I mean, it's grueling. It's isolated. You don't have fresh air. You can't exercise. You can't leave. The food is atrocious and it's not nutritious. And there's just it's absolutely mind-boggling that you could hold healthy, law-abiding, fully vaccinated citizens in these kinds of conditions.
Did you see? Look at that on the screen there too. I mean, I don't know if you could see that, but that was like a long white hallway, just like covered in plastic. Like this is where you get to stay. Your government's putting you here.
Have fun.
So this was happening all over the world. This wasn't just in Canada and Australia. Anywhere where governments kept people against their will. In Australia, which was one of the worst places, you had people trying to break out of these lockdown camps. Remember this?
A man has been arrested outside a quarantine hotel after escaping from his room. Police say the 24-year-old man was returned to his Tullamarine accommodation without further incident after leaving his room without permission this afternoon. Officers are now working with COVID-19 Quarantine Victoria to investigate the incident. The Herald Sun reports the man claims to be a Victorian resident who should have been allowed to self-isolate at home after visiting Sydney. He now faces more than $19,000 in fines.
What?
That's crazy.
Oh, just $19,000? Because he didn't want to be locked up against his will?
Right.
$19,000.
Okay. Now, we're not making excuses for Chinese lockdowns at all. We are pointing out a contradiction between how the media was fine with it for Western countries and is not fine with it for Eastern countries. But today, as China admits that it needs to make some changes in order to make life livable for its citizens, the Western media is all but devoid of stories showing that this may be in the process of being resolved. You would think, given how they splash it across headlines all day Monday over the weekend as well, that they would give us this update like life will be changing there. This is a sign of a government conversation. They're not. In fact, look at just this morning on CNBC, China protests could usher in more authoritative Xi era, analyst says. Okay, why? Is a good question. Look at the Financial Times. Xi Jinping's myth of infallibility tested as zero COVID protests rattle China. Well, okay, or another way to look at it is that there is, in fact, a conversation with the people happening right now, and he shows that he is a leader who listens to his people, possibly, right? That's another possibility rather than this extrapolation. Let's look at the Associated Press. Global shares mostly rise as markets eye China protests. Now, when I took these screenshots, this resolution had been unfolding for several hours, and the mainstream media just continued to show these headlines without any real, maybe this will change for them. Maybe this is a real sign. That's not clickbaity enough, apparently.
No, I mean, it's amazing, too. And you see, like, Max Blumenthal had a great thread today, too. Our friend of the show, Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone, he tweeted this. He said, I despise the corporate media that heroizes Chinese protesting interminable lockdowns, not because those Chinese citizens are wrong, but because that same media painted the Westerners who defied the COVIDian regime as criminals as they bravely defend their basic human rights. And, of course, he had a few really good examples of this, some that I'd forgotten about. But here is the pro-China one from CNN just the other day, or earlier this morning, yesterday. At the heart of China's protests against zero COVID, young people cry for freedom. Freedom. Oh, it's young people who are crying for freedom. They don't want to be locked up? Oh, okay. So then how did CNN cover it when it was in Europe? And young people didn't want to be locked up and didn't want jabs by their governments. Here's how CNN covered Europe. Europe's loud, rule-breaking, unvaccinated minority are falling out of society.
We don't want any of that riffraff.
Max,
that is so great. I mean, just pointing that out, I was like, those side by sides. I'm sitting here laughing.
There's so many of them. I have a whole stack of them in my office. All of this hypocrisy. I just chose a few here that I think are pretty good. Max Blumenthal tweets this: the trophy, though, for liberal hypocrisy goes to Amnesty International, which issued an unusual statement condemning Canadian anti-lockdown protesters as white supremacists and backing Trudeau's recession while warning Chinese police against arresting citizens protesting harsh lockdowns. So here is Amnesty International. Here's a great one. China. Government must not detain peaceful protesters as unprecedented demonstrations break out across the country. Then here's their take on Canada. Watch this one. Amnesty International Canada statement on Freedom Convoy blockade, Ottawa. Amnesty International has been following with great concern the developments relating to the Freedom Convoy blockade in Ottawa. Amnesty International Canada is deeply troubled by the reports of violence, harassment, intimidation, and hate speech, which have surfaced since January 29th, said Amnesty International Canada Secretary General. Nazi flags, Confederate flags, and other symbols of racism have exhibited no room in peaceful protests. They should have no place in peaceful protests. Equally concerning is the affiliation of some of the convoy organizers with overtly racist white supremacist groups.
Okay.
Totally debunked.
It's even
and you can be anti-government there.
Condescending.
Even the what? Sorry.
The headline is condescending, like Freedom Convoy in quotes and then blockade.
Yeah.
Like the so-called Freedom Convoy.
Right.
Who 80% of which, according to the data, were vaccinated. They were there just protesting the vaccine mandates, right? Not the vaccine itself, but just a minor detail. Here's one more good one for good measure. Naomi Klein, you might have read some of her climate writings and stuff. Here's Naomi Klein, a very pro-China tweet. Popular decentralized uprising in China against authoritarian rule has been so long in coming. The international left, such as it is, should stand in clear solidarity, she writes. Oh, but what about that article that Naomi Klein wrote for The Intercept earlier this year? Take a look at this. Toxic nostalgia, from Putin to Trump to trucker convoys. War is reshaping our world. Will we harness that urgency for climate action or succumb to a final deadly oil and gas boom? And she goes on to slam those people involved in these trucker convoys and anyone who was pushing for freedom. I love the hypocrisy.